All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here tonight. We've been looking forward to this for a long time, and I'm very excited. I think I can speak for my colleagues here. We've got a lot of fun stuff to talk about here tonight in this crystal ball webinar looking at the upcoming LSAT-Flex exams. So I'm not going to waste much time diving right into this. What I want to do, though, very briefly, is just give a couple of quick introductions, and then we'll get into the meat of the matter, as it were. My name is John Denning, and I'm going to be doing a lot of the talking tonight. Not all of it, but a lot, which is sort of my nature anyway. If you're wondering who is talking, you can look up to the top left-hand corner of your screen, and by my name there in bold, you will see off to the right a blue microphone. That means there's sound coming from me, or at least there should be. You'll notice, though, that I'm not alone here. I'm joined by a couple of other people in bold. One of whom maybe needs no introduction to any of you, Dave Killoran. Dave is the CEO of PowerScore, the author of the PowerScore Bibles, and obviously a hero in the community. He's going to also be on the microphone at times tonight, so we're going to trade back and forth. It won't quite be as free-flowing as a podcast, for those of you who've ever listened to one of those, but we will exchange this back and forth a little bit, so you'll hear Dave speaking as well as we get deeper in. And also joining us, I'm thrilled by this, is one of my absolute favorite instructors, a senior instructor of ours, I hope quarantining somewhere near me, Adam Tyson. He's based out here in Los Angeles, where I currently am as well. He's lucky to have a wife at home. I'm all alone. But anyway, that's the three of us that are going to be doing it. Adam's going to handle it's fine. Adam's going to handle the chat window, primarily down in the left corner. Yeah, he's awesome. And that's where you guys are really going to have the best opportunity to communicate with us. So no webcams, no headsets, just your fingers. Type away as we go. And feel free to ask questions. Although, as I will mention again in just a second, we're going to really open the floor up at the end of this for some questions. So be patient. Follow along. And let's talk about the strangeness ahead. Let's talk about what these LSAT-Flex exams are all about and how we see the year beginning to unfold. Here's what we know. This is not just about the next LSAT. Some of you may be registered for it. It's next Monday and Tuesday. I'll talk more about that in a second. But this is really, to me, about the slightly longer horizon of LSATs that we can see a bit about, or at least speak with a degree of informed speculation towards. And that's the May test, the June test, and the July LSAT as well. I'm speaking specifically to the North American LSATs. There is a late June test being given worldwide, June 28th and 29th, as currently planned. We'll see what happens. LSAC hasn't made any announcements about that. So if you guys are here for any kind of like international updates, we'll do our best, but we don't know much more than you do at this point. We do, however, know a lot about what's happening stateside, as it were. Let's talk about these three tests. And one of the first things that may catch your eye in this particular chart is that the first two headers here have multiple dates assigned to them. That's a very unusual thing for an LSAT to do, to really be offered as. What they're doing with these flex tests, at least in May and June, is they're actually giving people the opportunity to test on one of two possible days. They're spreading people out over about 48 hours or so. They've said that these tests will actually continue into the weeks beyond this. So the May 18th and 19th test, you're going to see some people on the 20th and beyond. But that's mostly for accommodations and one-off situations. The vast majority of people are going to be testing in May, next week, as a flex exam, and they'll be doing it on Monday and Tuesday. Ditto June, although that's being given as a flex exam on Sunday and Monday, so slightly different. July, at this point, you're going to see a few TBDs, to be determined, in the July column. There are certain things we don't know about it. I'm going to venture a guess in just a minute about July, but for now, they haven't made an official announcement. Right now, it's still as planned, as scheduled, which is Monday the 13th at 12:30 local time for you. So I'll talk about July in a second, but let's really focus on these first two first. You see that they're offered on 2 days, but one of the things that I am absolutely enamored by with the flex test is the fact that students get to pick the time of day that they test. in 20-minute increments over the course of 10 hours each day. So you can see on both Monday and Tuesday next week, you can test anywhere from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and you got to pick when your test started. That's fantastic, in my opinion, and you get to do it again in June. It's a Sunday and a Monday, but the same opportunity for a real customization of your test day experience exists. Like I said, July, we'll get to it in a second. But that's the idea of how these flex tests are at least being administered time-wise. Dave and I had a conversation in a podcast recently where we landed on more or less the same side of this fence, but we talked about how it is that you know when the best time of day for you to test is. Should you take it first thing in the morning? Should you wait until a later spot? Should you wait until the second day or take it the very first? Dave and I were both in very similar positions, knowing ourselves, we're not morning people. So for me, in doing this, I would want to test later in the afternoon. That's when I tend to hit my stride a bit, as hopefully tonight proves. And I would probably shift towards the second day of testing. It's just rough to be a guinea pig with a brand new thing, which this is. I know people from last year in the digital test rollout can definitely verify that statement. But this is how it works. If any one of you here is registered for the June test, the June Flex LSAT in North America on one of those 2 days, tomorrow morning is when you get to pick your time as of this recording. So May 13th, that's when you get to wake up and decide when you want to take your LSAT. Be mindful of that. I haven't heard a lot of horror stories about spots filling up, but it never hurts to be first in line. So pay attention to that. You see another thing here. This is a lot of happy columns and rows so far. The score release on both of these flex exams in May and June have been expedited a little bit. The score release for the June 5th release for the May test is about an 18-day turnaround at worst. They've actually phrased this as it will be out by June 5th. It will be out by June 30th. I've heard Kelly Testy say this multiple times. I know Dave and Adam have too. So it's possible they're even faster, but that's a pretty quick release in the grand scheme of things. 18 days is faster than the 20 to 22 we're used to. And this one here is closer to 2 weeks. You test on June 14th or 15th, and you've got a score at worst 15 or 16 days later. That's pretty good. So kudos to LSAC for at least rushing these out. And you see again as we track over to the right into uncertain territory, they haven't made an announcement about the July release yet, in large part because they don't know what July is going to be. They do know certain things about these tests, though. They know the nature of the release type that they have planned. All three of these tests, and this is really the only bad news row in this table, all three of these tests are non-disclosed. I'm not going to get into a long thing about what that means, but just very briefly as a quick definition, what it means is that no one who takes these tests is ever going to see, or at least not for years and years, going to see a copy of the test itself. You won't see your answer sheet. You won't know what you got right or wrong. You won't be able to revisit game 3 that confused you. You won't see the scoring scale or the curve of that test. All of that kept under wraps, kept in the vault, presumably so they can use these things again down the road. But that's what we've got. And this is pretty unprecedented, guys. June tests are almost always disclosed. In fact, I can't remember the last time one wasn't. This means we're going to go all the way until August of this year, again, presumably, before we get a new, fresh copy of an LSAT. It's been since last November that we had one. That's like a 10, 11-month potential turnaround before we get to see new LSAT content. That's rough. I admit it. I don't like it. It's rough. Those are the breaks. This is what it is. The final column here, I do need to probably put some clarifying details on. You know, we're forced in making a table like this to abbreviate things a bit, and I've done so here. So let me explain what I mean with this particular row of do schools accept. What schools have really been focused on is how they're going to use these tests for admission this calendar year. So for people who want to start in the fall of 2020, schools are talking very vocally and transparently, which is good, about how they're going to treat people who take these tests and get these results. People who maybe were going to take March or April and have been de facto basically pushed into this May exam if they want to take it as a flex. Most schools have said they're willing to extend their deadlines and consider those scores. There are a couple of outliers, a couple of schools out there that are just being really strict on their original deadlines and aren't going to touch May, or at least they claim they won't. But almost all of them will. So if you're taking this May test next week, maybe to get off a wait list, maybe to renegotiate financial situations or scholarships, maybe is your opportunity to apply for this fall. There are the vast majority of schools out there who say they will consider you. It's an uphill battle. Rolling admissions is still a thing. There are fewer seats remaining, but you're not out of luck if you're taking the May test. And ditto June. The numbers begin to shrink a little bit among schools who say they will take the June results, but there are still a lot of schools out there that are looking at June test takers and saying, look, let us know your credentials. Let's see what you got. Schools want to say yes to you, and they're willing to delay the no if they have an opportunity to maybe get better credentials and change their mind. And we're seeing that, which is great. It's great. July starts to get really thin. There aren't many schools that can wait. Again, if it's given on July 13th, even a quick turnaround can wait until almost the 1st of August to start making these kinds of decisions. There are some, not a lot. So 2 points that I'll make then about this particular row down here. One, every school in the country will take the flex exam and treat it exactly, identically to the way that they would treat a normal test. And we'll tell you the differences here in just a minute. If you're wondering what flex even means, Dave's about to educate you. Every school in the country has said they are not going to view the results of the flex test any differently. So if you're applying to start next year, your flex score is as good as anyone's, as good as any tests. So don't worry about that. But there is some uncertainty about this year, and this is the second point that I'll make to you. If you're not sure, contact the school. Contact whatever school you're interested in applying to, or you're in some scholarship negotiation with, you're waitlisted. Ask them how they're going to treat these upcoming test dates and test results. It could very well be the case that you get an extension on your application based on this. So that's what I mean. Do schools accept? Universally, yes, but not for another year. Incrementally, yes, but you can start to see how it shrinks as you go. So that's what I mean. Excellent. Let me tell you a little bit then, on the heels of almost what feels like an administrative overview of the flex test here. Let me tell you what the structure of tonight's conversation is going to be and why I'm so excited about it, because each of these bullets is fun to me. Yeah. First, we're going to talk a little bit, Dave specifically is going to talk to you, about how the flex test, the LSAT-Flex, is formatted, how it's put together, how it's being administered, and what you can do to really make the most of that experience for yourself, because it's very unique, it's kind of quirky. There are things you can do to improve what I think will be your experience. So that's going to be the first part of this. The bulk of it, though, and if you've ever been in attendance to one of these Crystal Ball webinars, if you've listened to the podcast where we've had these conversations, you'll know some of this. We're going to do a pretty deep dive, data-wise, into what we expect the test makers to do on these upcoming flex tests. Section by section, question type by question type. We're going to really look. And I'll go so far as to say, I'm happy to stand on my own here on this branch, but we're going to do this in a more detailed way than we've ever done in terms of the specificity of what we predict, down to the question counts, section by section. It's a little risky, but I'm willing to take it. These are risky days. That's how we're going to start to approach the actual content of what you're likely to see on these next several tests. And then, as almost an undercurrent or a just running theme through the discussion, we're also going to talk about our own expectations for the year, for tests ahead, for LSAC's behavior, for what might just happen as you begin to, again, continue to navigate this process further into some very uncertain waters. And at the end, like I said, we're going to have a Q&A that we're going to be able to touch on some of those subjects a little bit further. But that's the way this is structured. This is the way the Flex is, at least at present, set to run. So I hope that helps to give you at least a framework. What I want to do is let Dave jump in here and take that framework many steps further, get more detailed. So, Dave, if you're ready, all you, man.
John, I was born ready. All right, everybody. Good evening. I hope everybody's doing great tonight. So John just given us an excellent overview of really the next couple of tests. And I know there's a lot of questions about July and the later tests. They haven't said yet. So what we're talking about here applies specifically to the next two exams that we know are LSAT-Flex tests. But if those later exams are turned into LSAT-Flex exams, this will apply to them as well. So let's make sure that we are all on the same page as far as what this test is really about and how it is both similar to a regular LSAT and how it is different from a regular LSAT. So let's start off right here and we'll give a basic breakdown of how this test actually plays out. And if you've listened to our podcast before, we go a lot deeper in our podcast into how this is actually set up. But the first thing is all the question types that you're used to seeing in terms of sections, they're still here. There's still logical reasoning, there's logic games, and there's reading comprehension. The difference here, and everybody notices it instantaneously, is that there is just one logical reasoning section. And so consequently, that changes really the weighting of the power of each section. Used to be that LR was 50% of the test. Now it drops down to roughly 33%. It also means that relatively speaking, logic games and reading comprehension, which used to be about a quarter of the test, give or take a little bit, they're now pumped up in importance. So as you study and go forward, take that into account. If you're just trying to decide between a little bit of studying on logical reasoning and logic games, and you're weaker on games, maybe spend a little more time on logic games. Now, one of the questions that really comes up very early in a discussion of this new format is, are the questions going to be more difficult? And LSAC has made a very big production of saying that is not the case, that these are regular, authentic, genuine LSAT questions, and they are not harder. What they are claiming is they're good enough from a psychometric standpoint, so test prediction and so forth, to be able to take 3 out of the 4 sections and figure out what you would have gotten on the regular test. And so what that means is that instead of dealing with an LSAT that is the normal 101 scored questions, you're actually going to be seeing 74 to 76 questions. Now, the first thought that everybody had was, why? Why drop a scored section? Why drop an experimental section? A normal LSAT is 5 sections. This LSAT-Flex test is only 3 sections. And really the reason is test security. There are no breaks on this exam. Usually there's a break between section 3 and 4. Now, once you get to the end of section 3, your test is over. So it's 35 minutes each. That means you have an hour and 45 minutes of testing, no breaks, straight through, 1 section of each. Now, do we know exactly if it's going to be 74, 75, or 76 on any given test? We do not. They haven't said. They're not going to say. So you can ask all you want. I certainly have. Spoke to them just this afternoon, as a matter of fact, prior to this seminar, and always ask the same type of questions, and I always get the same type of answers. We're not going to talk about it. And that's, I don't think, unreasonable on their part. So as you look at these questions, there is some fear. It's like, will these be harder? No. All it means is that if there are fewer questions, in a relative sense, each question becomes a little bit more important. You have less room for error, so to speak. But everything that you're looking at is a regular LSAT question. And tonight, one of the things that we'll do is both John and I will go through each section, as he mentioned, and we'll talk about what will these 74 to 76 questions actually be comprised of. But another important point is that all the questions are scored and weighted equally. This is really key as you take a look at things because it means that logical reasoning is not doubled. It's not as if you get one right and it counts for 2 points. That is not the way the scaling on this has actually worked. Now, ultimately, your LSAT-Flex score is still going to produce a 120 to 180 score. And that's why, as John was talking about the law schools and their use of this test, that 120 to 180, which they are so familiar with, this is one reason that they're all able to say, we're going to use this and we're going to weight it kind of comparatively equally to the so-called regular LSAT that is actually out there. So as you're looking at that 120 to 180, we saw on the bottom row of that prior chart that John was going through that for this cycle, depending on the test, a lot of schools will still use it, down to a few schools will use it as it gets later. Next year, because this test is supposed to be really on par with a regular LSAT, what the law schools are saying is we're all going to use it. And so far as looking at next year, I haven't heard a law school say that they won't use it or they won't consider it. And that makes a lot of sense because this is obviously an extraordinary situation that we're all dealing with. The law schools are trying to deal with it as well and be as reasonable as possible. I think what they're going to do is say, look, it's just another LSAT. It's the same questions. They're saying it's just as predictive, and they're going to keep it kind of like on that same equal footing as the regular LSAT. Now, one of the most important things to talk about is the way the scaling actually works. And we're going to push that off towards the end. There's been a lot of questions online. John and I have both answered tons of questions. I know Adam has as well, about how you convert a regular LSAT scale into one of these LSAT-Flex scales. We're actually going to go through that in detail, which should give all of you a really good idea of how many questions you can miss to achieve certain scores, which becomes really interesting the higher up the scale you go. It'll give you a sense of like, can I miss 3 questions? Can I miss 5? What will that do to my score? We will go into detail on that. But just from a very brief overview, the thing that we can say about the LSAT-Flex test is that it really, in many respects, it's like a normal LSAT. It's shortened, but you can still do all the things that you would normally do. You get a 120 to 180 score. You see the same types of questions. The same 3 sections are out there. You can cancel the score if you need to. And so a lot of what you're going to see is going to be the same thing as if you were taking it in person at a university or a conference center or what have you. And what that says to me is obviously everybody out there is a little nervous. They're like, new test, it's weird, it's different, no one's done this before, I feel like a guinea pig. Maybe so. But at the same time, the bulk of what you are doing is the same thing that you've been preparing for the whole time. So look at that from a positive standpoint and then realize that all of you who are able to take this test have some really big advantages. I don't think for everybody taking it home is always an advantage. Screaming kids next door or up above you, the dog's barking, there's cars outside. But for many people, the home experience is comforting. They feel better about it. And it's a shortened test. You only have an hour and 45 minutes. You don't have to waste time on an experimental. You don't have to go through kind of like that double LR situation. There's a lot of positives. That's just touching kind of like the tip of the iceberg. There's more positives than that. But as you sit there and look at it, you should probably take a moment and be like, I'm getting a unique opportunity, shorter than any LSAT anyone's ever taken before that produced an actual score. So take comfort in that, use that to your advantage, and go in with confidence when you actually approach this test. So that's kind of like a brief overview of the format and scoring. Let's talk a little bit about the very interesting situation of taking a test at home. And I know LSAC, maybe they thought about this at some point in the future, but they really didn't know this was going to happen. And I've said many times that I'm really pleased that they worked as hard as they did and as fast as they did to produce something like this. They could have sat back and said sorry, but they made an effort. And at least on that level, I appreciate it. We'll see what happens when the tests actually go off, and I'm crossing my fingers that things go really, really well. But they've kind of put a lot of effort into it. And as you see in some of the comments, people making note that they've gone out of their way in certain instances to try to help individuals who have issues with like Wi-Fi and computers and so forth. So let's talk about exactly what's needed to take this test, how it will actually work, and really how it will look when you sit down and take it at home. So the first thing is this. The interface that they have used to show people what the digital LSAT will look like, which they originally called their familiar site and now is known as Law Hub, that's basically what your test is going to look like. It is going to be proctored by a service that is known as ProctorU. And if you've taken the LSAT writing previously, It's the same company. So they went with something that they are familiar with. Have there been problems with ProctorU? Yeah, there's been some. There's also been a number of successful tests that have gone through. And now that they've worked together for a while, we're hopeful that the number of problems from a technical standpoint will be very minimal. The one thing that you will want to do before the test actually occurs is go into the ProctorU website and clear your desktop or laptop to meet their technical specifications. That's something that you have to do and you want to do just to make sure that you are actually covered. And if you have problems, you can then sit down with them and they can access your computer and make sure that everything looks good. But that actually brings up the next point, which is that even though the digital LSAT is provided on Microsoft Surface Go tablets, that's not how this test will work. By and large, you have to have a desktop or a laptop, and it needs to run standard Windows or Mac operating systems. Ironically enough, tablets don't qualify. So after spending all that time and money to create a tablet test that they could give in person, when they went to actually administer this test, they couldn't make that work. However, there is kind of a very interesting, silver lining to the idea that you're taking on a desktop or laptop. This is a browser-based test now, and that means that any kind of browser-based function, one that I've been asked about a lot is the search function, Control F, that will actually work. So whether or not that's useful to you is a totally different question. For me, it would not be all that useful, but for many students who have asked me about it, they're like, well, I'm used to using that to search for terms or what have you if I want to find something in Reading Comp Passage. That will actually be available to you since it's part of your normal suite of browser activities. And then the last thing that you see here is that for accommodated test takers, who certainly might have been worried about this type of transition, LSAC has worked really hard to make sure that all the accommodations that anyone has been granted are still in effect. That even goes down to paper tests. So if you're taking it from a paper-based standpoint, they've actually worked that out so that you will get that exam beforehand and be able to take it in that particular form. So when you look at this, the kind of home setup is you're at your house, your apartment, wherever the case may be. You're taking on a desktop or laptop. You're going to have to sign into ProctorU, which we'll talk about in just a second. And from that point on, it'll be an hour and 45 minutes that you roll through this test and you're able to kind of work through it, no breaks. Aside from the fact that you're now at home, this is not all that dissimilar from, say, the first 3 sections of an in-person test. And for those of you out there who have had technical issues of some sort, whether you didn't have a computer, for example, or whether you didn't have good Wi-Fi, I know for a fact that LSAC has worked with a number of people to either supply them with the hardware or to supply them with a location where they can actually take the test. So they've been pretty good about that. And if you've been worried about those things, especially if you're taking that June test, get in contact with them. So it's kind of an interesting point when you take a look at this at home. It'll be really interesting. If you have roommates, ask them to be quiet. If you have pets, ask them to be quiet or give them a good run beforehand. So now one of the things that LSAC has said about the testing situation over the years is that they're highly concerned about security measures and how things will actually play out. Let's talk a little bit about this because this affects the way your experience will go. And I saw a lot of questions beforehand about, well, what can I have in the room? What do I need? And so forth. We're going to talk about that right now. And I'm not going to put down these giant lists. Those lists are actually online. There's a really nice FAQ on the LSAC site that covers what you can have with you, what you cannot have. Let's talk a little bit about the experience of starting the test and what it'll be like. So the first thing is they're going to activate the webcam. You have to have one of those. And they're going to check in on you. You're going to have to present an ID that identifies who you are. It's going to have your name match your registration for LSAC and so forth. And then they're going to check in on you every once in a while. So it's not going to be that someone's just staring at you for the entire hour and 45 minutes. The way it works is that multiple test takers are assigned to the same proctor. So they might pop in, they might see you on a screen where there's 100 other people. You will, however, be monitored electronically. That means, and they've called it AI, just that's probably slightly overblown in my opinion, but we'll call it that for now. It means that if things happen that are out of the ordinary, such as a loud noise or talking or some kind of disruption, their system will flag that. And I'll talk about that a little bit because it's the last point down here. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of the world. There's a number of instances here where they're aware that things will happen. But just be aware that everything that you do, every mouse movement, every keystroke, every movement of your head, you're being watched and technically recorded. So if there is a problem, they can always go back to it later. And if you're approaching this test in an above board manner, which I'm sure everyone is, that's really great because that means that later on you can point to the recording and be like, look, that was just my dog barking and me saying, be quiet, Sparky. So that's the kind of situation where you know you're being watched, but from a test taking standpoint, just ignore it. Once you get checked in and ready to go and the test starts, don't worry about the fact that there's a monitoring system going on. Focus instead on the questions. The person monitoring you for sure does not care. They're just there. They're getting their hourly wage and they're just checking boxes. They're not actively interested in whether or not you're answering certain things. They can't even see that technically. They're not really all that worried about certain things that are out of the ordinary other than just following the rules. Now, the rules are very interesting here. As you look at some of the things that you have, there's a number of things that are prohibited. You can't get up during the test. You can't go to the bathroom. You can't have other computer programs running. The only electronics you're allowed to have in the room are a single phone, but you can't have recorders. You can't have other computers. You can't have other monitors. You can't have things like backpacks or briefcases. You can't wear a hoodie. You can't have a hat on. You can't have sunglasses on. Anything that would put them in a position of not being able to identify you. And by the way, that includes if you have like earbuds, earpods, or AirPods, anything like that in your ears, can't have it. So that's somewhat restrictive, but what they're really telling you is sit in front of the computer, keep your face visible, work on the test, and then be done with it. I find that somewhat Big Brother-ish, but that's the way they're comforting themselves to be happy about the test security issues that are actually floating around out there. And I will point out, just to kind of like reiterate at the end of this second bullet, you cannot read aloud to yourself. They have said that you must be silent. And I realize that's not great for some people who kind of like whisper. They are concerned about that being a security issue. Now, let's talk about some of the things that are allowed. Because when you go to that next bullet, the second bullet is really like, you can't have all these things. The third bullet is, well, what can you have? Well, you can have 5 blank sheets of scratch paper. And you're going to have to show them to the proctor. You're going to be like, sheet 1, front and back, sheet 2, front and back. That way they know that they are actually blank. But the good thing is you do get scratch paper. That was one of the big early questions. As far as I know, it's supposed to be blank, meaning not lined. So I personally think it doesn't make a bit of difference, but they haven't really gone too far into detail. A lot of the information was, understandably pushed out extremely quickly. I think if somebody had lined paper, it might work, but the safer bet is to have entirely blank scratch paper. What else can you have? Well, you've got your ID that you have to have floating around. You can have number 2 pencils or HB pencils. You can have a highlighter. All right, so these are things that you're typically able to use during the actual test. You can have a regular rubber eraser. You can't have a mechanical eraser. You can't have a sleeve on it. You can have a pencil sharpener. So like one of those manual pencil sharpeners, not an electric one. You can have some tissues in case you have a cold. And then you can have something to drink. However, in what I always think of this rule as like the preschool rule, it has to either be in a plastic container or in a juice box. And the maximum size is 20 ounces. You cannot have a regular aluminum can, and you cannot have mechanical pencils. So You got to show all of that to the proctor during your security check-in. And as well, you have to show both sides of the scratch paper. So that's actually a lot. You can also have something like an analog watch. Although, given the fact that the screen has a timer in it, why would you need a mechanical watch or an analog watch? But if you want to, you can actually have it. So that's a pretty simple list. Again, the LSAC website has the same type of list that's there, but it gives you a good sense of what you're looking at. What happens if there's a problem? This is the thing that most people fear, and they're worried that they might inadvertently set off the security. Or what if their Wi-Fi goes out and there's a technical issue? Well, these things are different. If there's a technical issue and your test is actually stopped, according to ProctorU and LSAC, your progress is typically recorded, and after you regain connection, you can continue the test. So you're not just out of luck. You know, if you're an hour and a half into it and all of a sudden some quick power outage happens, you're not dead in the water. What if there is the so-called flagging violation? You know, the noise. What if somebody walks into the room? This is where I think they've actually shown a lot of reasonability. These things happen. Dogs do bark. Cars, hit their horns outside your window. What they've said is they'll flag it, and then they'll go take a look at it. And what that really means is the system will note that there was some kind of noise event or some type of movement event that was unexpected, and then a person will look at it. If it is something simple, like somebody walked into the room, you can be like, I'm taking a test, please leave. They'll look at that. They'll be like, all right, you didn't transmit any test information. That's fine. And they'll go ahead and approve your test. What they are looking for is not the everyday quotidian events that we deal with. What they're looking for is something unusual. Somebody whispering throughout the entire test. Somebody reaching over and turning on some kind of device. So if your pet walks in, you're allowed to be like, sit down. They're not going to freak out about you telling your dog to sit down. Those types of things are acceptable. So what that really should instill in you is a lot of confidence, because what it really means is that, again, aside from the weirdness of somebody watching you and being monitored, as long as you focus on the test and just kind of like stay where you are, you will, for the most part, be good. And maybe is a problem of sorts. And if there is, after the test, come talk to us. John and I can be found, typically on Twitter, a lot of times on our LSAT forum, occasionally on Reddit, and we're always answering questions for people and trying to help out, especially when there are problems. So hopefully that gives you at least some comfort as you look at the way this is all set up. Yes, it's strange, but it's not something that, everybody's used a computer here. And you should have a degree of comfort with the general tools and the interface available to you. So hopefully that helps out a little bit. What we want to talk about now is we want to turn to really what I think a lot of people are really interested in, what's actually on the test itself. And for that, I'm going to turn it back to John and let him talk about logical reasoning. John?
Well, thanks, man. Yeah, it's funny. Dave had a conversation with LSAC not 2 or 3 hours before we all logged in here together tonight. So he has definitely got his finger to the pulse of this thing. Best any of us can, frankly. The pulse is erratic, but we're trying. And honestly, we continue to learn things. So bear with us as we learn and we disseminate. But you guys are asking some really good questions down in the chat. One of the things that I will mention before I even turn to logical reasoning, this entire session right now is being recorded. Not quite as intrusively as ProctorU, but we are actually recording all the audio, what's on the screen, what's in the chat, and we're going to send each of you guys, if you're curious, a link. We'll just email you a link to this archive, this video archive. So if you want to go back and see some of the questions and answers, because they're pretty fast and furious down there to the left, it's a really good opportunity to explore this from a slightly different angle and get some additional information. So thank you guys for the questions. Adam, thank you for your fleet fingers. I wish I could keep up. Let's talk then. Let's make this transitional move into what we actually expect to be the content of these Flex exams. And even into July. Look, if July somehow And fingers crossed, I'm in LA County, and they just extended our stay-at-home orders for 3 more months. So I don't think July is going to be much fun for me, but if somehow we're able to run this back in person in July, the content that we're about to discuss, the breakdown, distributions, etc., all of those things should still apply well to July, but in particular for the next 2 tests, I think you're going to find this really useful. Let's start with what is easily the strangest place to begin to deconstruct the LSAT-Flex test, which is with its single logical reasoning section. Logical reasoning is no longer the most important thing on the LSAT, at least in terms of score from questions. From raw score to converted score, logical reasoning doesn't matter as much as other sections do, as reading comprehension, for instance, because it tends to be more questions. So we're going to want to really focus on that idea, that perspective, as we start to look at these logical reasoning question types. Not just how to prioritize within that section, but prioritize on the whole. How do I look at logical reasoning through this new dynamic, this new calculus where logical reasoning is less than a third of my score, or roughly a third of my score, as opposed to a full half, if not more of it? So we'll want to talk about that as we go through. What I have done to start us off with, though, is I've tried to break down some of the most common questions into what I consider to be their frequency strata, their frequency orbit. And you can see over here on the left, in this first column, I've got 4 questions that are ultimately going to dominate. No matter individually what they look like, collectively, they're really going to dominate what your logical reasoning performance looks like. Part of that has to do with just how often they appear. You can see down here underneath this table, over half of the questions from the last 3 years, from the last 36 or so, or I guess it's more than that, 72 or so, logical reasoning sections that we've had a chance to look at have been really dominated, or at least the majority dominated, by just these 4 question types. So obviously those are going to be at the forefront of our consideration. But then we get some oddballs in there. We get some that really vary. Weekend questions, sometimes you see a section with 1, sometimes you see a section with 4 or 5, a test with 2 or 3, a test with 8. That's a hugely variable type of occurrence. And again, I'm going to talk about that as we go. And then, of course, you just get your outlier types, things that either seem to be more de-emphasized of late, which is justify, and then things that have just never really carried much weight. Evaluate, cannot be true. Just real fringe question types. So we're going to be able to at least apply some degree of like hierarchical, stratified consideration, prioritization as we go through this. But like I said at the outset, guys, and circling back to it, we're going to take this one step further. I'm actually going to tell you how many flaw questions I think are going to be on your test. Not roughly. I'm going to give a number. I'm putting myself out there, and I think this is probably why Dave passed the mic back. Although he's going to do something similar in reading comp and games, and neither one of us get off the hook entirely. But that's the way we're going to run through this. Let's talk about question counts and what I expect to see for a 26-question logical reasoning section. And of course, you can adjust up or down a little bit, but I think 26 is probably a pretty safe bet. The majority of LR over the past few years have been 26. So we might see 25. I doubt we'll see 27. Could see 24. But here's what I think is going to happen. And you can see from the very outset here, the way that I created this is I tried to break them into categorical strength, or just categorical gravity and impact. This first set of questions, coming right back from this first column of frequent, is going to account for the majority of what you're very likely to see. And again, if you tally these up, you can see 4, 4, 3, 2. That's 13 of the 26 questions. So even if it's 26, that's half. If you can do these 4 things well, you're halfway done. That's powerful to understand. And you can see that must be true and flaw in the reasoning tend to really carry this section. Strengthen can get up there. And assumption questions, what we would call necessary assumptions in maybe the looser parlance, PowerScore, we just call them assumption questions. But these 4 question types in particular, I think are going to really serve as the bulk of what you see. That can be a very good thing. If you're good at them, obviously, that's wonderful. But these are also some of the trickiest questions. Strengthen tends to be harder than weaken, as we'll see. Assumption tends to be harder than just about anything. for a lot of people. Daniel, I'll get there. Must be true, though, flaw in the reasoning, those are really just the backbone, the bedrock of this test. If you can spot what's wrong in an argument and you can develop your own proper inferences from facts, what's wrong is flaw, the facts, the inferences, the conclusions that you draw correctly is must, you can do just about anything on this test. So it's no wonder that these skills are so emphasized. But as we start to move into the middle ground here, what you begin to see is that questions start to take on less and less significance. They just get tested less often. Justify questions, what a lot of people would call a sufficient assumption, different than a necessary assumption, but sort of kindred spirits in a way, as I'll show you on the next slide, in fact. These are probably going to appear 2 times on your test. You might see 1. You could see 3. I'd be a little surprised if there were 3. 2, I think, is a pretty safe bet there. Weakens the wild card in this set, in these 4. You could see 1. You could see 2, which again is my prediction. You could see 4. I don't think it's going to get there, but again, if you recall where I put weaken back before, it's in that variable column. Weaken tends to be a little bit tougher to pin down. And then we actually find a pair that are extremely consistent. Parallel reasoning, a question type that terrifies a lot of people just from the bulk of it, tend to happen twice per section. I think there's only been 1 test in the last 3 years where there weren't 4 parallel reasoning questions split 2 and 2 into logical reasoning. So if I had to lay any kind of money down on the numbers you see on your screen, it's 2 parallel, that's my bet. And chances are pretty good that they're going to split those 2, 1 and 1, into a regular parallel and what we call a parallel flaw. A parallel flaw is a question where there's actually an error in the argument, and you not only have to duplicate the nature and the structure of the argument, you got to find an answer choice that commits the same mistake. You're probably going to see 2 of those. That's a good bet. And resolve has been pretty consistent as well. So I think you're probably going to see 2 resolve questions. But you can see among these 4, some of which are very challenging or very time-consuming, there's really only 8 questions in there. It's less than a third of your score versus these top 4, which is at least a half, as I see it. So consider this as you go. If you get practice test results, if you go, say, to our digital site and you download one of our Flex tests, which gives you full analytics, it completely scores itself and converts, and I'll show you how we do that at the end of this tonight. And you see that you struggled equally with something like flaw and method of reasoning. It's no question where you need to devote your immediate energy, your immediate attention. That's what this is really designed to illustrate. You could see 5 flaw. You could see 5 must be true. So the idea here is, guys, you have to recognize the significance of individual question types. Not everything on the LSAT is created, or at least behaves, equally. And then we get into some truly outlier question types, and we'll talk more about the very last one down there in a second. Main point, everybody knows what that is. They give you an argument and you're asked to identify the conclusion. They've de-emphasized this a lot in recent years because everyone has more or less gotten comfortable with the process. You're probably going to see 1. You might see 2. Might not see any. 1's a good bet. Method of reasoning and method of reasoning argument part, which is what the little dash AP stands there for. I couldn't write the whole thing. It made the whole slide look weird. So I did AP as an abbreviation, as we do in our scoring algorithms and feedback. What those 2 questions are essentially doing, method is asking you to abstractly describe how the author has constructed his or her argument. Method argument part asks you the role of an individual sentence or phrase in that argument to the overall construction of it. Is it a premise, a counter premise? Is it the conclusion or a subsidiary, intermediate conclusion? That's what these question types are doing. These are very structural, though. Main points, all structure. Method AP, argument part, all structural. They've gotten away from some of this. When we look at something like pointed issue, which is just describing the disagreement, I could see 2 of these coming up. I think 1's the slightly safer bet. Pointed issue is the one here where I was kind of like, I hedged a bit. But I think probably just 1. And then 2 questions that we've had to combine, that's how rare they are. We had to combine cannot be true and evaluate the argument to even get ourselves up to a single example. These are the rarest 2 question types on the LSAT, bar none. So collectively between the 2, you might see 1, you could see 2, but that's pretty unusual. Focus on these top 4. And guys, interestingly enough, there's another way that we can begin to group these questions and consider their frequency. It's not always just by type. It's sometimes by relationship, the nature, as I see it, of how the stimulus, that initial information that you're given, relates to the answer choices going up or going down. We call these families. And there are 4 of them. 4 families that we discuss. The first family involves questions like must be true, flaw in the reasoning, and you can already probably tell why this bar is so much longer. It involves things like main point, parallel reasoning. All of these are in that first family where what you're given at the outset is what you are essentially asked to evaluate and prove something from. That's why I put the little colon prove on this row. First family questions are giving you information and asking you to prove something from it or describe something about it, like main point. That is going to be, in my estimation, about half, if not more, of what occurs in your single logical reasoning section on these flex tests. And when the flex days are over, on both logical reasoning sections on a normal test. It's historically true, and it's going to be true for you in May. It's going to be true for you in June and beyond. So this is an incredibly important skill to develop. But that's not the only type of relationship that you're tested on. In fact, these middle 2 rows, in a sense, are kindred spirits. They're almost sibling ideas, help and hurt. What you're doing here is you're taking answer choices and you're applying them upward, usually to an argument, a belief in the stimulus, and you're trying to either improve it, help it, or hurt it. Make it seem less credible, less likely. That's weaken. But you can start to see, guys, with the second family, there's still a whole lot of contribution, roughly a third or more in this. That's a 9-question tally that we have there. There are 4 questions here. This is strengthen, which is a big one. Assumption, another big one. We've got justify, as we just saw, and we've got kind of that oddball, the half-sibling, resolve the paradox. But all of those, in a way, are giving you new information and answer choices that you're using in a helpful way going up. And then weaken questions down here, which I'm estimating at 2. Do something similar, but in the opposite direction, if that makes sense. I can affect this argument, good or bad. Good is help, bad is hurt, strengthen, weaken. That's what you're asked to do. But if you're going to focus in collective question studying, this is the way that you'd want to do it. This is the way you would want to go. There's only 3 questions that I estimate are going to fall outside of these first 2 families. This is the way that you want to try to approach the test and your studies leading into it. Even if all you have left at this point, guys, is 6 days before your May exam, you still know what it is that you can focus on in logical reasoning. The trouble, of course, is that logical reasoning just doesn't contribute as much as it used to. If you get really, really good at logical reasoning, the flex tests are a bit of bad news. We've talked a lot more, interestingly enough, about some of these logical reasoning ideas, about some of these actual question types in a number of different podcasts. So what I want to do to kind of close out this logical reasoning examination is point you guys in the direction of a lot of great free content. And I do feel comfortable, despite it being self-describing, saying that this is great. These episodes are really good. I was there for them. Dave was there for them. Some of you have probably listened to them. But this is a good time for a screenshot or grab your cell phone or something if you want. These are the episodes to date in our LSAT podcast where we have talked about specific logical reasoning ideas or even question types. There was a deep dive into parallel. Thanks, Caroline. We talked about outliers, evaluate and cannot. If you recall, they're not super popular. So those are probably the ones. This episode here, interesting as it is, this is probably something to listen to last if you had to prioritize these, struggling with LR going forward. We've talked about the 2 different types of assumption questions. Basic assumptions, heavy hitter. Justify questions, sufficient assumptions. But together, those really form an important part of your approach. And then we just did an extensive run-through of flaw in the reasoning questions, what is likely to be the most common thing you see on test day, often is. Well, we talked about the common flaws 3 times in a row, which is Dave and I ran through them. And then we talked about probably my favorite episode in that series, What do you do with a question where you can't identify or put your finger on what the flaw actually is? What do you do when you don't know what to call it? That's what this episode 29 was. So I think each of these serves as a really valuable resource. Flaw, necessary assumptions, probably the top of the list. Outliers, probably the bottom of the list. But all of these, I think, are going to give you an insight, not just in how the section works, but in how to develop a mentality and perspective that's going to make you better as you go through it, no matter what it is that you encounter. So that's my logical reasoning breakdown. And as much as I would love to dive into the other two sections, in this particular LSAT-Flex discussion, they're less interesting. So I'm going to do the selfish thing and turn it back over to Dave. Sorry, buddy.
John. I don't know if I agree with that approach, but I'm going to take it anyway.
Cool.
Because I actually think the sections I'm going to talk about here are pretty interesting. Especially because in a certain respect, they're a lot more predictable than are the logical reasoning section. And that's because in logical reasoning, there's so many different types of questions. You have 13 different types of questions. You have a bunch of different forms of logic, conditional reasoning, causal reasoning, all these things floating around. There's a ton of different combinations. When you get into reading comprehension and then ultimately logic games, what we see is a narrowing of the basic topics and skills that they're going to ask you about. So, as we take a look at reading comprehension here, this is what our prediction is for the topics that you are going to see on the Flex test. And it's actually really straightforward. You're talking probably half the test will be humanities passages. Then you've got 1 out of the 4 passages will be law-related, and then another of the 4 will be science-oriented. And I'm not saying that this is the order that you're going to see these topics in. It could be any particular way. But when you look at a given LSAT, what you typically see in reading comprehension is a really high degree of consistency. There's almost always a science passage of some sort. There's almost always a law passage of some sort. There's almost always at least one humanities passage. That right there is 75% of your typical LSAT reading comp section. That last passage, more often than not, it is actually humanities. And you can see down here that when we look at the last 36 passages that appeared on the LSAT, 19 of those 36, so just over 50%, 19 of those 36 were humanities-based. So predicting that 2 of the passages are going to be humanities, that's not really putting ourselves out on a big branch. I feel pretty confident saying that's very likely to happen. Now, does it have to happen? No, it is possible that it could be law or science as well. And you see that in those 36, that made up the remainder. Just a little bit under 50% of what people were looking at were law or science passages. This test is very consistent in what they are examining. So if you've gone through 3 passages on the test and you haven't seen something that's law-related, I'm thinking to myself, when I go into that 4th passage, probably going to be about something legally oriented. Now, of course, the problem there is that is a really broad categorization. It could be about the court system. It could be about juries. It could be about some specific law. It could be about a problem with witnesses. There are many different directions that they can go in. But as far as the basic topics that you're going to see, this gives you some information about what you expect to run into. So, if you don't like science and the first passage is science, skip it. Come back to it later. Do the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, which are probably not science-oriented, and then come back to the first passage and do it. And one point I will make is that we're talking just about the content that you're going to see. This is not the seminar where we're going to talk about the exact skills in terms of taking it. I'll get to that at the end of this, but right now we're just talking about the kind of things that you will see in terms of content, and that might be question types, it might be passage type, frequencies, and so forth. So on that note, let's actually look at the type of questions that you typically run into. Now, if you're familiar with our courses or our books, you know that when we're examining the types of questions that you're asked, the vast majority of them are must-be-true questions. Like 90+% of the questions in reading comprehension are just giant must be true exercises. So that's not all that helpful. All right, what did you read and what do you know? This is the foundation of the legal canon, is that you have to read cases, you have to read arguments and opinions and understand what was being said. If you can't do that, you're not going to do well in law school, and it's going to be difficult to be a great lawyer. So that's why they ask about must be true so much. But the way they actually vary that, so it is a little bit different than, say, a logical reasoning question over and over, is they vary the level of information and detail that they ask for. And we separate those into three basic categories. General reference, which is really about the passage as a whole. Which one of the following must be true would be a classic general reference question. Concept reference, where they talk about an idea that can be narrowed down, but not to a specific line. The author talks about authoritarianism and has which one of the following opinions. That would be a concept reference type of question. And then specific reference, where they, in the old test, would send you to, say, lines 12 and 13. Now they would typically send you to a highlighted area or a quoted area. So those are kind of like the three levels of information that they're asking you about. And as you look at the overall questions, historically, what you see is that general reference is really the big one. It's almost 50% of the questions that you're being asked. And if you think about that, half the questions are on the big picture. So a lot of that is going to be broad-based, or at least forcing you to understand where information is in the passage. And, we use a view stamp method that is really, in my way of thinking, kind of like a loose system for categorizing different viewpoints, the structure of the passage, what the main point is, and so forth. This kind of works to reflect this idea. About a third of the questions are going to be that kind of mid-sized idea, where they talk about something specific that was mentioned, but they don't send you to a particular part of the passage. And here, we'd expect to see around 9, maybe 10 questions in the concept reference section. So whereas you might see 12 or 13 general reference questions, now you're looking at a couple less on the concept reference. And then there's usually at least 5, 6, or 7 questions that specifically direct you to look at something and say, the author talked about this idea, what's going on there? So I love kind of understanding this type of thing, especially as you get towards, situations where you might not have a huge amount of time, for example, because if you're running out of time, specific reference questions are great. You know right where to go, you can read about it, and in many instances, the answer's fairly close by. So you can use information like this to understand the questions that you're being asked and prepare for, I need to make sure I focus on the big picture. That's where the majority of questions come from. And that there are kind of like techniques and methods to use those specific reference questions so that you can attack those, especially when you run out of time. But they vary these ideas back and forth in order to throw you off guard. And I always say that knowledge is power, and forewarned is being forearmed. So as long as you know that all of this stuff is coming at you, it sure makes it a lot easier when you're in the midst of the passage. So the question types that you see and the passage types that you see are really standard. The big problem is it's harder to get really specific. Other than knowing that everything is, by and large, a must-be-true type of question, you can't really go a whole lot deeper than this. What you can do is, if you have problems, is you can turn to some of the resources that we've actually previously mentioned in our podcast, but I'm going to post them here. It gives you a good idea of some of the things that we've talked about. One of the things that's come up a lot tonight is how do you deal with reading comprehension in a digital testing environment? In our podcast in episode 13, we talked a little bit about that. It de-emphasizes using the highlighter and increases the use of quickly sketched notes on scratch paper. So if you're thinking, I don't know what to do with this or how to do it, that's an episode that is worth listening to. Even though it applies to the regular digital LSAT, it also applies to the LSAT-Flex. The other thing is, if you're having trouble with reading comprehension, recently we did a podcast episode that was about reading comprehension skill tests. And then just a month ago, I think it was a month ago, maybe it was 2 months ago. I'm not actually sure. We did a live webinar just like this one that was about skills and diagnostic tests, and that's available online. And these two are a pair. What these two can do for you is if you are struggling with reading comprehension, you can go in and use the various skill tests that we talk about to self-examine and see where you are strong, and hopefully, if you have any weaknesses, to identify those and to then kind of attack them thereafter. So even though reading comprehension is more difficult to get specific about, that doesn't mean there aren't really great tools. In fact, I think some of these tools are better than what you can find in like games and logical reasoning at times to self-diagnose and determine whether or not you are really as strong as you should be. So definitely check out those resources that are out there. So on that note, let's move to a section that some people love, some people fear, some people just kind of feel I wish it didn't exist. Let's talk about logic games. And the first thing that we want to kind of go through here is the basic game types and what is most likely to occur and what is least likely to occur. We know that on this test, both reading comprehension and logic games take on an outsized importance compared to a regular test, simply because there's fewer LR questions. The thing that I'm going to point you to is actually down at the bottom of the screen. This is an incredible statistic in some respects because it says that 97% of the games in the last 3 years, and this is very consistent over time, have been some version of really linear and grouping. Might be basic linear or sequencing, could be advanced linear, could be grouping itself, or it could be grouping/linear combination games. But the vast, vast majority of games that you see on the LSAT focus on one of these two skills or the combination thereof. So when you are studying, this is the place to put all your energy. Now, that said, you look over here in the least likely column, and what do you see? You see the games that strike the greatest fear to some extent to people. The ones that are more outliers, the rarer types. You see circular, mapping, and then pattern. Those are the ones that everybody kind of flips out about. But if you think about it, they don't show up all that often. Having kind of like that weird, strange, unusual, crazy game is not the norm. It's actually the exception. The problem is that in our minds, as we lead up to the test, those games start taking on kind of like, monstrous proportions. What is it I'm looking at? I fear something unusual. Fear of the unknown is a completely natural human emotion and response. I'm telling you right now, this isn't that likely. However, if you're one of those people, and I can understand if you're thinking to yourself, yeah, but Dave, I could be the person that gets the test with the pattern game on it or the circular game on it. If you're one of those people, then what I will do is I will point you towards our complete list of outlier games. So if you fear it, this is a master list of the games that have appeared over time in each one of these categories. We post them here not to say, gee, look how many pattern games there were, or, there weren't that many circular games, but more so that you can be able to say, if I'm really worried about, say, a circular game, well, I can go take a look at some examples. Here they are. And the circular game is actually a great example when you look over here. Look how infrequent this is. Prep Test 1, Prep Test 8, then again on the Super Prep in 1999, 41, and then Prep Test 88. It's few and far between. And even Prep Test 88 is that display cases game that really doesn't need to be done in a circular fashion. So when you look at something like this, you may think to yourself, I am worried about circular games. Chances are not great. It's kind of like being struck by lightning. It does happen, and it totally sucks when it happens, but it's not really likely to occur to you. So if you do have this fear, that list right there at least gives you a handy reference so that you can go out and study those a little bit more. And sometimes just reacquainting yourself with the principles of something like a circular game or a pattern game is really helpful because then you feel like you checked that box. I'm totally that person. I'm going to check all the boxes beforehand and make sure that I feel as comfortable as possible. If you're trying to decide, should I study this or linear and grouping, I would say if it's either or, study the linear and grouping stuff instead. If you have time, sure, do some of this. Get yourself reacquainted with it. So let's turn specifically to the flex test and what we expect to see here. What do we think we're actually going to see? Well, we just talked about how grouping and linearity are 97% of this exam. And as you look at this test, probably on a test like this, you're going to see at least one grouping game. You're going to see at least one basic linear game, probably see one advanced linear game. That last or fourth game on the list could be any of these, but percentage-wise, it's more often than not going to be grouping. So if I had to predict what we're going to see on this upcoming test, I'd think probably looking at two grouping games, a basic linear and advanced linear. If they came out and they did, say, two advanced linear instead, wouldn't surprise me. A little bit less likely, but it is entirely possible. You look at most LSAT sections, there's some variation on this theme. It's usually something like this, and if it's not grouping that's doubled, it's one of the other ones that are doubled. That should give you confidence. Those are the types of games that hopefully you've studied a lot, you've seen, you understand the basic principles, you know how to diagram them. So instead of being concerned about the things that are less likely to happen, instead be focused more on the fact that, hey, I know most of this. I'm familiar with a lot of these things. That should make you feel good, because it's our opinion that all the flex tests will probably be closer to normal and closer to the midline as opposed to being something wild and out there. They don't have a lot of room to throw something that's super hard because they lost 25 questions. They can't make that up. They can't offset difficulty because they have fewer questions. That means you're less likely to see something super easy, but beautifully, you're less likely to see something super hard. I can't say for sure, but I would, if I had to go to the great LSAT casino, I would bet against some kind of ultra killer game or ultra killer reading comprehension passage. Will there be difficult LR? Yes. Will the game section be difficult? For sure. It always is. But super hard, like historic, seems very unlikely that they would use a test like this to do something like that. All right, let's move on. Talk a little bit about what you might see inside those games. And I want to talk a little bit about two what we call advanced features. And more so because I want to remind everyone to think about these and to look for them prior to the test prior to getting into the section itself. And that is templates and numerical distributions. These are elements that either can be applied to games, in the case of templates, or are a feature of the game as opposed to numerical distributions. But because they're not one of the big types, like grouping or linear, a lot of times people forget about them. Take a look at what you see, though. When we look at the recent tests, about half of the games feature one or both of these elements. It wouldn't be no surprise to me at all if 2 of the 4 games were template games, meaning they are best attacked by charting out at least part, if not all, of the possibilities. So that tells you that almost for sure, at least one of them will be. And if you can gain time in a game by showing some templates, make sure you do that. And I'll refer you to a resource at the end of this discussion here in just a moment that kind of reflects some more information on that. Same thing with numerical distributions. John and I talked about an LSAT, I think it was last year, where 3 of the 4 games, if I recall correctly, were really numerically oriented. And if you weren't thinking about numbers, it would really hurt you. Whereas if numbers was part of your focus and really part of your tool set in analyzing games, it gave you a big boost. So go in thinking about the fact that templates is something that you can apply to at least some of the games, and that numerical distributions are likely floating around in at least one or more of the games. And then you see some percentages down below that kind of talk about 1/3 of the logic games out there are best attacked by templates or limited solution sets. That's incredibly powerful information to have beforehand, because it should mean that you don't forget that aspect. All right, Let's move on and take a look really quickly at the types of questions that they ask. This one's simple. We won't be on this page very long. 23 questions in a section typically. It's about 50-50. Usually about 12 of the questions are global. Would not be surprised to see the remainder then be local. And if you think about it, global questions are all about the big picture. It's all about your setup and understanding, did you get a pretty good idea of what's going on? Whereas local questions are the questions that say, if T is third, then which of the following must be true? Or if S occurs before Y, which of the following cannot be true? They add information to the discussion. Those are very focused. And I love the kind of like the dichotomy between these two questions, because a global question says, how good was your setup and how good is your general knowledge of the game? Whereas a local question says, how good are you now that we've added information? Can you manipulate what's going on? And part of the beauty for me of local questions is, even if your setup's not great, a local question allows you to work with the variables. And a lot of times you can learn more about the game with those local questions. So if you didn't have a great setup, you can still score some points. Now, those are the big classifications that we use in logic games. There's also some outlier types. And by outlier, I mean they're relatively rare. Let's glance at those. And I love this chart. John and I had a laugh when we were putting this chart together because here we are, 23 questions. And then you see over here these little mini bars that are all there on roughly one question. For example, we get a lot of questions about like rule substitution problems. Probably more so than certainly they are justified in having, because they only occur typically once on an LSAT. So if you have a problem with the rule substitution question, get out of there. Move on. Go on to the next game or the next question and don't worry about it. It's a very, very small part. But again, just like those outlier games, it's the kind of thing that strikes fear. And so when I look at something like this with the kind of rare specialized types, just like with the rare specialized games, I think to myself, don't stress about the outliers. That's not where the majority of points are coming from. The majority of points are coming from the standard types. They test basic skills over and over and over again. To spice things up and keep it interesting, they occasionally throw in something different in terms of the game type or the question type. That should not throw you off. So, hopefully that's a useful way to think about this and orients you in terms of thinking about the major components being tested. If you're still thinking to yourself, yeah, that's great, knowing that doesn't make me feel better or doesn't help me, let me refer you to some resources that we have that we've talked about previously. And again, we'll use the podcast because it's such a helpful format for us to be able to get across a lot of information. And I'm going to point out a couple different things here. First off, if templates and solution sets are something that have troubled you or you're not entirely confident, listen to this episode 21. It really goes through the kind of triggers in a game that would lead you down the path of showing templates or showing all the solutions. And to me, it's incredibly useful because it's a kind of roadmap that says, well, when I see this, it makes me think that maybe there aren't that many possibilities. So really helpful, especially if you don't feel confident with that concept. These two episodes are great reviews of in-depth discussions of logic game sections where you can see us discuss how we would have approached it, what we would have done from a diagramming standpoint. In a sorts, it's an instant replay of what was seen on those tests. So what I would recommend is going out, doing the section, and then coming back and listening to it and saying, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? What could have I improved upon? And that way, sometimes by watching the same play over and over again, you start to see everything a little bit more clearly. It starts to go a little bit more slowly. That's what those two episodes do there. And then just very recently, within the last 10 episodes, we've done a 2-part series, so to speak, about how to get faster at both in logic games, not just the section, but in individual games as well. And so if that's something, and I think most people would agree that it's always an issue, so if it's an area of concern, go listen to those as well. Maybe you're out there jogging, you're running on the treadmill, even if you're just doing push-ups or whatever, That's the kind of thing you can listen to and say to yourself, all right, I understand it. It's, one little tip could equal 1 point. And that's the key thing here. Every little benefit is super helpful. So, on that note, that brings us to the close of the discussion that we have of the 3 section types: logical reasoning, reading comprehension, and logic games. You go back, and if you look at some of those slides, you'll see that we've made very specific predictions that say this is the typical section, this is what we think that you'll see. Very likely to be extremely close to what they actually do. Could there be some variation? Yes, but in the main, this has proven time and time again when we've done this to be pretty accurate in terms of content, and we're very confident that the LSAT-Flex test will match up with this as well. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about, that we said we would talk about, is that LSAT-Flex scoring scale. And John is the super expert on that, so I'm going to turn it back to him for this discussion.
Well, geez, no pressure, huh? All right. I don't know if I'm a super expert on this, in part because the operative nature of how we're going about doing the flex scale conversion is in part still mysterious. There's only so much that LSAC is ever going to reveal or tell us about how it is that they're doing things behind the scenes. But we do feel like we've got a pretty good grip on it, or at least the only, as I can see it, and Dave agrees, the only presumptively logical way that they can tackle this conversion, 75 questions, scaling it up to the same sort of test that 101 questions would have previously produced. I'll also say this too, guys, because I want to make this distinction clear. I've been asked, 40 or 50 times in the chat window down there about whether these predictions in this discussion only applies to the flex tests, or if this is going to count for July, if it can somehow miraculously occur in person, or August, or if the world lives into 2021 and there's more tests then. And the answer is that all of this stuff is still remarkably consistent, remarkably predictable. What Dave's just given you in games, whether it's a flex LSAT, whether it's games as one of 4 scored sections, whether you're doing it at home or digitally in person, or you've traveled overseas and get the good old paper pencil experience, all of these predictions still hold up in terms of what individual sections are likely to do, and they are borne out repeatedly, as Dave just told you. Historically, they stand up. We've been doing this for a long time. I can tell you these are the best you're going to get in terms of your expectations, whether it's May, whether it's November. So keep that in mind. The only real difference about the flex experience is it just shifts the weighting with the WEI. The weighting of how each section contributes to the overall score. So most of this, despite the fact that we've got a real flex-centric focus tonight, is, I think, more broadly applicable than you might realize. Except this last bit. I say all that to essentially say we're about to approach the one time tonight where I can say this is flex only. This is exclusively a flex conversation. Here's what I want to show you guys. And in part, I'm not just doing this to explain how it is that we have approached our own flex tests that we offer, flex tests that we give to our students and they can score and that scale up automatically, magically. But also so that if you guys have a 4-section test, you go buy one or you've just got a stack of, LSAT tests sitting around, as I'm sure many of you do, that you can take those 4-section tests and move in either direction. If I cut a section out, what would that look like? If I recreate my own flex experience, how do I scale it? How do I score it? If I've got a 4-section test score, raw score, how do I see what that might look like from a flex standpoint? So I want to try to give you guys something of an algorithm that you can use for yourself. That's what I would be trying to do. And I'm actually going to do it, interestingly enough, with the 2 most recent disclosed tests that we have available to us. This is one of those 2. Prep Test 88. You can see if you're looking at your screen, this is September 2019. And so what we did in looking at this test is the first thing was we considered the original scale. And again, if you're looking at this and wondering where all these numbers below 170 went, I had to cut this down so it would fit on the screen. I kept all the scores from 170 to 180, but after that I went in 5-point increments, just to give you a sense of how the overall dynamic of this looked, what the overall kind of comparison would be. But if you look, there were 101 questions on this test, and you can start to track down and see how many you can miss or how many you have to get right to hit certain score goals, which we've helpfully color-coded in blue here. This was a test with a fairly loose scale. Put another way, this was a hard test. You could miss 13 questions and get that 170. Out of the 101, you only had to get 88 right to get to a 170. And again, that's the metric that most people use. That's the sort of dividing line. But you track down and you had to get 81 right for a 165. And I won't do this all the way down, you could see. Only 56 is a minimum for a 150. 57 would have done the same thing, so that's kind of useless. But you can start to track how this goes. What we did then for the September test is we looked at the 2 logical reasoning sections and we pulled one out. And when we did that, we then only had 75 questions here to go. As we start to run through this, then we have to do a conversion. You have to be able to take, say, 60 questions right down here and figure out what that would have looked like from a regular standpoint. And there's a pretty simple bit of, I guess it's arithmetic, frankly. I almost said algebra, but it's really not. You just compare. You just compare if there are 75 questions left, take it as a percentage of 101, or take 101 and see how much greater a percentage that is of 75. And then use that as your multiplier. It converts roughly for most tests to either about 3/4 of the original scaled down. And again, you can see this perfectly in some cases. A 140 was 40 questions originally. The flex test would have been 30. That's an exact 75%. And it gets close up in other spots too, as you can see. 60 to 81, that's very, very nearly 3/4. But this is the way you can convert in both directions. How could I multiply 75, 1 point whatever, to get it up to 101? Well, that's what I'll multiply my raw score by. What's tricky in this, guys, as you can probably imagine, is if you've only got 75 raw points versus 100 raw points, you're not going to get nearly as many outcomes, or put another way, there's going to be a lot more overlap. You can see, for instance, 95 questions in September would have gotten you a 177. Not bad. There was no way to get a 177 on this flex multiplier. There just wasn't enough room between 70 right and 71 right. So some of these scores, and this will naturally happen, guys, on these flex tests, some of these scores simply are not going to be available. It's not a problem, especially if you, as you can see here, sort of round it up. 177 was right between a 70 and a 71, so a 71 becomes a 178. That's what you have to do. You got to assign it to something. So that's the way that we have gone about this. That to me is actually not the most interesting point. It's interesting to see the underlying math, but it's more interesting, I think, for you to compare tests side by side and see just what an individual test day might produce for you. This is kind of the luck of the draw. Dave actually referred to it a little bit earlier and has talked about it many times and wrote one of my favorite blog articles of his of all time called the LSAT Casino. Some of this is just what you happen to get. Games you like, one LR section versus 2, that kind of thing. Let me compare the other most recent test to September. I'm going to put them side by side for you. The other test that we have available, I wish we had more recent. It was November of last year, Prep Test 89. That is the most current thing we have. 101 questions again. But look at some of these outcomes and the difference. And it may not strike you as hugely dramatic, but 2 or 3 questions more or less is a big deal, especially as you have fewer questions on a flex test. Look at the 170 marker here in November. Before September, you had to get 88 right. November, you had to get 3 more questions. You had to be 3% better to get to that same outcome. That's rough. But what it tells you and why this happens is it's designed to offset subtle changes, but notable changes in overall difficulty and performance. These tests are really well designed, but they're never going to be perfect from one to the next. So the test makers use this as something of a safety net, a buffer after the fact. And again, you can make the conversion. In this case, we pulled out a 25 section LR, And you can see how we converted that. There's some multiple from 76 to 101. That multiple then applies all the way down. But you can see by these little asterisks, these placeholders, we are losing a lot of the scores, especially in the higher ranks. And if you could see down here, 120 to 130, we lost some there as well, where one question equals 1 point. So this is the idea behind how this works. What I'm trying to give you guys, though, not so much an illustration, but more a toolkit. You're going to want to practice for the Flex test, even if July is your test date. I'm telling you, you're going to want to be ready for Flex. And this is how you can take content you have or content you intend to purchase and convert it in a useful way. I linked earlier a blog post that we put together that had within it a Flex calculator, where essentially you would put how many questions were in each of the 3 sections, your raw score of those, and it would convert it up into a scaled raw score that then you can apply to the scoring scale, like we see over here, of that original test. I can relink that blog post as we wrap things up and go into a Q&A. If you haven't seen it, you can search it out. But you want to be able to be ready for Flex, and you also want to see if the Flex is the right format for you, frankly. In the same way we talked about testing in the morning versus the afternoon to see when you should schedule your exam, it may be that the Flex isn't going to do you the favors that you hope. Maybe you're not as good at home. Maybe you need that extra LR to buffet some reading comp or logic games deficiencies. These are the sorts of things that you need to test. But this is a way, very precisely as far as we can tell, that you can do that. So that's how this algorithm works. Cool. And again, I hope one day they release their own calculator LSAC and they're like, here's what it is for every test. But I'm not holding my breath. Well, not unless I go outside. The last thing that I want to do then, guys, away from the Flex test, away from this discussion, and as we begin to approach what's going to be kind of a more open-ended Q&A, although if there are more questions, I can't imagine what they'd be, is let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing as we try to maintain as much efficiency and productivity and helpfulness as we can during what are not only some uncertain times, but just some unusually strange times stuck at home. And one of the first things that we did as soon as it was clear that we were either going to have to start moving classes online or even moving our own employees to their homes remotely online is we put together what we called a stuck at home sale. It's a little on the nose, but it works. And you can see what we've done. We were able to maintain full inventory and shipping power for all of our books, the Bibles, everything. And then we put them all 20% off. So you don't get stuck on these Amazon delays. You don't get stuck on any of that. We'll send you your book the same day you order it. And it's discounted by a fifth. Oh, sorry, that's the courses. I apologize. The books, we actually went over a third off. We really discounted the books because, again, we know that's what a lot of people are going to do. They're going to sit at home and read. But the courses are great, too. So you can see the discounts here. And we've just added a new one. A new line of assistance that is now discounted. We've taken 10% off all of our tutoring packages as well. So I don't want this to come across as a hard sales pitch, but I do want you guys to be aware of the fact that, look, we're trying to look out for you as best we can, and there really has never been a time to both study, what else are you going to do, and find some discounts on things that are usually much, well, appreciably more expensive. Worth it, but more. So consider self-study with the Bible's collections. Consider our courses. This feels a little bittersweet to read the subtext down there. We don't have in-person courses running right now, as you can imagine, but fingers crossed, everything crossed, that one day we will get them going again. I'm certain that we will. I'm just not certain when. But for now, we were able to move people into live online courses that are just like this, frankly. This is a live online interface that we use for our classes. If you felt like you could communicate and learn here, that you were getting attention, that you, again, found some progress. This is exactly what our live online courses are like. And we also have on-demand options. You can move at your own pace, watch videos, jump around, review things as needed. So some really powerful things that you can do from the safety of your own home and get yourself ready not only for hopefully an emergence from quarantine, but for taking a test at your home or taking a test on a computer itself. We're running admissions counseling and admissions consulting specials right now too, where we're really working hard to get as many students as we can out of the pipeline or out of this, what feels sometimes like a clogged drain at this time of year. We know schools are waiting on decisions and test results and things. We can actually help speed that process up. We're propelling students further through wait lists and financial negotiations and things through our admissions consulting. So especially this time of year, it's a good thing to think about. And the last screen that I will put up as we continue to answer some of your questions, I hope, is just a way to say not only thank you for taking the time to be here, but also to remind you guys that we're available. Dave, myself, Adam, we do all that we can, as much as we can, to be available to you. So if you ever need anything, here's how you can reach us. You can send emails, you can call. Our office phones are still on. And of course, you can go to our website and submit information and questions and queries there as well. So please take advantage of that, guys. I hope you don't feel too alone out there. I know I sometimes do. We're doing our best to be available to you. Take advantage. Utilize that. All right. I'm going to jump off the microphone, I think, and we'll see what questions come in. And Dave may hop back on the microphone, as he is wont to do. But we'll continue to answer things as they come in chat for, I'd say, a reasonable amount of time. Before I hop off, though, once again, Adam, Dave, thank you guys. And to all of you who made it here and to anyone listening to this recording as part of the archive, whenever that may be, man, we're really rooting for you. We're wishing you the best. Stay safe above all, but study hard. Push yourself through this time. You'll be glad you did, and it'll be worth it, I promise, in the end, if you can make some hay even when the sun doesn't shine. So we will talk to you guys again soon. Thank you, though, so much. It really means a lot that you guys took some time out of your day to be here with us. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Talk soon.